issues that seems to be under siege in many different aspects of American society right now is free speech and the ability for people to express themselves, their concerns, their thoughts, their feelings about issues of the day if it goes against some sort of mold that you shouldn't be going against. Facebook is providing a case in point of this. Multiple reports now from Facebook that are about Facebook suppressing protests that are notifications, groups, Facebook groups that are trying to put together these Reopen America rallies and stay-at-home order protests across the country. Now, we can debate and hash out the merits of these protests, but should they be blocking on Facebook these individuals? How should they be approaching protests with which they disagree? David Harsanyi is a senior writer at the National Review, and he joins us now, having written about this very topic to discuss. David, welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I'll play Mark Zuckerberg talking about this in just a moment, but what do you make of the overall dynamic of free speech online today, of which I think this is a part?
Well, I am not one who believes that we should be interfering in the contours of what's acceptable speech is on social media platforms. I think there's enough competition where you don't want the government being empowered to do that sort of thing because they will use that power in the future in ways you might not like. So just as a sort of I have a principled objection to that. Should they? I think they should have a dispassionate view of speech, because I think if they're really just a platform for interactions and speech of different kinds of speech, that they shouldn't try to make, judgment calls on what's acceptable and what's not, unless it's something abusive. However, if, like it has seemingly now, worked with states, and it's a little bit unclear to me whether they approach the states for guidance or the states approach them, to undermine people who are trying to meet and protest the government. I'm not saying that my view of how we should handle them changes, but clearly they're okay with the government telling them what to do, and for me, that's a problem. It's a problematic policy.
Yeah, I'm not so surprised about Facebook being okay with the government telling them what to do. I mean, we can recall a couple of years ago now, Mark Zuckerberg testified before the United States Senate, and he said, if it's the right regulation, I'm good with that kind of regulation. So the idea that a lot of these big tech companies are opposed to regulation, if they can have a seat at the table and help decide how that operates or work in concert with government to preclude regulation, but do what the governments would like, that doesn't come as a surprise to me.
No, of course not. They want the government to dictate what the contours of speech are, because it relieves them of the responsibility of doing it themselves. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's all kinds of rent-seeking and other things that go on with big, giant corporations, with these social media companies are. So clearly, Facebook would like more regulations as long as it didn't undermine the bottom line. So yeah, I mean, you're right about that. I'm just being somewhat facetious about it. I think they probably have always worked with government entities to deal with speech. I just think that when you have something such a clear undermining of the ability of people to protest, where you work in concert with a local government in trying to undermine the ability of people to get together and protest government policy of the state that they're working with, it's just wrong on many levels. I don't know if it's illegal, but it's certainly a way to undermine free expression in the way that we view it, in the constitutional view, perhaps not the letter of the law.
Let's hear from Mark Zuckerberg on ABC. This is Cut 3 on ABC News, where he was specifically asked about how he's handling these protests online. We'll get that clip going.
How do you deal with the fact that Facebook is now being used to organize a lot of these protests to defy social distancing, defy the social distancing guidelines in states? Is somebody trying to organize something like that, does that qualify as harmful information?
We do classify that as harmful misinformation, and we take that down. At the same time, it's important that people can debate policies, so there's a line on this. But more than normal political discourse, I think a lot of the stuff that people are saying that is false around a health emergency like this can be classified as harmful misinformation.
What do you make of that? I mean, he's trying to present it as though he's doing the responsible thing, making sure that the public isn't getting harmful misinformation from these protesters and rally goers, when we do know that there is some of that out there.
Well, first of all, the entire framing of the question was wrong. They're not getting together to break social distancing guidelines. Some obviously did, but many of them were protesting the idea that the state can tell them what they can buy in a box store, or where they can go to church, or if they can do a drive-up mass for Easter, or if they can protest. So the idea that the protesters were only engaged in trying to undermine guidelines that are already set is wrong. They want new guidelines. They want different sorts of things. That's first of all. Secondly, it is rather, I think, funny that Facebook believes that it can control that kind of speech, factually incorrect, theorizing, rumor mongering, whatever it is during an emergency, but then lead people, as they do, to the World Health Organization site to give them reliable information, when we know that it was groups like WHO working in conjunction with China that undermined our ability to save thousands of lives, when this was first breaking out, when coronavirus was first breaking out. So that, I think, just setting aside anything to do with free expression, shows how difficult it is to try to control the actions of literally billions of people, I think, are on Facebook, right? And in what is proper or what is factual or reliable. That's why you should just keep it an open debate.
Yeah, the whole point that you raise about the World Health Organization, which has an absolute crisis of credibility, at a minimum, to be sure, that is such, I think, a profound point, because when we're looking at what's happening right now, vis-a-vis Facebook making determinations about what's credible, what's not, what's misinformation, what's accurate information, and yet they're highlighting the WHO, that seems like a blatant contradiction, to be sure, and also something where it makes you wonder, how reliable is Facebook? I mean, I'm sure we were wondering it already, but how reliable is a company like Facebook at actually determining what information is accurate and credible and what's not?
I would say not reliable at all, right? I mean, no offense to young people, but having a bunch of young people just monitoring what people say and deciding what's right or wrong is an idiotic way to approach a platform. But more than that, I think, listen, I'm not saying everything the WHO says is unreliable. Clearly, they are reliable. But if there are people out there who think that, I'm just going to say this because I saw it as an example in one of the pieces. If someone's saying, hey, if you drink some bleach, you're going to be okay, and then someone drinks bleach, I think at some point that's just on them, right? You can't teach stupid, and there are going to be stupid people out there who believe ridiculous things. It's always been the way. And, I'm sorry for them, but that's just how life works. If someone's willing to drink bleach right now because of coronavirus, they're probably willing to do a lot of stupid things that they shouldn't be doing.
Again, we're talking with David Harsanyi, senior writer at the National Review, here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Okay, so I agree with what you're saying. However, some would critique it and say, well, if Facebook isn't standing up for free speech, then the government should step in and force them to do so, which is interesting given that at the same time, Facebook is looking to government for guidance on these things and oftentimes coordinating with governments on what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, what they'd like, what they wouldn't like, just as you and I were talking about a moment ago. So how do you think the free speech online issue, because this is a much broader question than just COVID-19 shutdown protests and rallies, how do you think that this fits in, and what people should keep in mind as we talk about moving forward the free speech debate when it comes to online outlets like Facebook or YouTube or Twitter and what have you?
Obviously, it's pretty complicated, and obviously the Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have acted in ways that are ideological in determining whose speech is okay and whose speech isn't okay. I mean, it seems clear to me that if Hamas or other terrorist groups can have Twitter accounts, but right wing kooks can't, I think that shows a bias that shouldn't exist. So I think it's bad bad corporate policy for them to get involved in speech in that way, because I can curate my own experience on Twitter by blocking people, by following people, things like that. I think that they should improve those. But these are just things I think they should do. what I always worry about is when I hear someone saying that government is going to come in and make things fairer. I would just ask someone to show me where that's ever happened. Government will not make it fairer. Government will start to impose its own ideals and morals on the conversation. And I think that this is something people should worry about. Even conservatives who are upset about how Twitter is acting or Facebook should worry that once government is empowered to dictate what appropriate speech is going to dictate what appropriate speech is moving forward. And you might not like what those lines look like. Right. So I would much rather prefer that we try to open these things up to more competition and see what happens in that way. But I admit that a lot like Google and YouTube, these people have dominate the marketplace in a way that is nearly like a monopoly. But I don't think it is yet, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I don't think we're at monopoly levels yet either, David Harsanyi. But one thing that comes to mind always when I think about the idea of conservatives, for example, who advocate for government stepping in to protect free speech is that, look, government has force, a monopoly on force. That's the definition of government. So government can actually force certain activities. Facebook doesn't force you and cannot force you to use its service, nor can Twitter, nor can YouTube. Now, you may feel like you have to use those services, but that doesn't mean that you must. However, when the government steps in and starts dictating certain things related to speech, you can't say no or decline that because government actually has the force of law in a way that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube never could.
I mean, yeah, I think that that's an argument that we should be making, or some of us should be making, because, against the populist idea that corporations are just as, nefarious, or not that they're just as nefarious, but they have just as much power as government over your lives. No, they do not. First of all, corporations, rise and die all the time. When you get older, you realize that. But more than that, they, as you mentioned, do not have the power of force. They can't compel you to do things. I'm not on Facebook anymore, and I'm very happy not to be on there. And my life is no worse. I don't need Facebook to live. I need water. I might need, roads and other things in the world. But I certainly don't need Facebook, and others in the social media sphere compete with them, like, Twitter or others. So Instagram, whatever it is. Obviously, they're not all exactly the same, but the idea is the same, that you're communicating with a bunch of people on this platform. So, but I don't want to dismiss that. I think what they're doing is problematic. I just don't have a solution to how to deal with it. I think you don't want to make, turn to a solution that becomes worse than the problem. And we've done that many times in many areas. So, but I think it is problematic that Facebook feels the need to listen to the state to undermine speech.
Yeah,
it should not do that. And I think that if there's anger among its consumers, it may do less of that.
Exactly.
So, but I don't have there's no easy answer to it.
It is pushing back against the companies. That is the way in which we can have a voice when they do something that we think is wrong as far as policy. Now, whether or not they're going to listen is a different story. David Harsanyi, just a few minutes left with you again, our guest, senior writer at National Review. I want to read a paragraph from your piece, Facebook Fails the Coronavirus Test, specifically where you focus on something a little bit broader than just the Facebook issue, but on the whole question of reopening. You say, in reality, the economy is going to reopen only when most people either feel safe enough to emerge from isolation or calculate that the risk of emerging is worthwhile. Arbitrary deadlines mean little. I suspect that the best way to temper anger surrounding the lockdowns would be for local leaders to stop acting like a bunch of petty authoritarians when the vast majority of citizens are already voluntarily doing what the government is asking to protect themselves. I think that's a fundamental point, because there's this presumption that seems to be going about that if states start to reopen, and I'm here in Colorado where our governor surprisingly is actually following through with his pledge to begin reopening starting in the next week or so, that means all the companies will suddenly reopen. That's not the case. Companies will make their own determinations whether or not it's time, and then consumers will make the judgment themselves. Do they want to go out there? And I think that's a fundamentally important point that we're losing in this discussion right now, David.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points there. One is that people will decide, in the sense that Donald Trump might say, "Hey, Easter, we're gonna all come out," and then change his mind, because it doesn't work that way. You can't just give me a date that's neat, works out for you in your rhetoric. I'm not just picking on Donald Trump. I think many governors and other people have given arbitrary deadlines, sometimes really far away. Well, I think this is just a way for them to speak to folks and try to give them some sort of guidance, but I don't think that that's how it's going to work. And then the other end of this, though, is what I notice a lot is that people can't tell the difference between convincing us and coercing us. There's nothing wrong with telling people to stay indoors, and they should. And most people, when you look at polls, think it's the right thing to do, and most people do it. But then, on the other hand, there's a difference when you start telling people they have to do it, that they can't buy seeds, that they can't go to a mass, that they can't do this, they can't do that. I think that it's those petty, authoritarian, arbitrary, and unilateral, laws, basically, but they're not passed laws, but just unilateral actions by governors, is what really sort of sparked this anger, which I think is wholly applicable to the situation. Meaning, I think that when people tell you can't go to church, I think you have every right to protest. That's what you should do. And obviously, I'm not saying that everyone does this. I think many police forces and mayors are great about it. But in Brighton, Colorado, they arrested a woman, a dad who was playing t-ball in a park. I mean, that's the sort of thing that angers folks.
With a 6-year-old kid.
Right. When no one's near them, or you can't surf in the ocean when no one's near you. You can't hike on millions of acres of land when there's no one near you. I mean, these are things that overstep common sense and also the law, especially when you tell people they can't protest. The Constitution isn't suspended because of a pandemic. So right. I think that those are the people to blame for these protests, not so much the protesters.
Philip Rucker on MSNBC the other day, and we played this clip in the last couple of days, but he literally said their right to protest goes against the social distancing guidelines. Well, maybe so, maybe not, depending on how they actually are engaging in that protest, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't exercise their right or are not allowed to exercise their right to protest. But something else that I'm noticing is going on, and you referenced this as well in your piece for National Review the other day, David Harsanyi, is that you have now New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio encouraging snitching on neighbors. You have a mayor in New Jersey who literally is having drones monitor people and find out whether or not they are following the social distancing guidelines, interestingly enough, using Chinese technology that I think the Pentagon won't even use. What do you make of that aspect of this, where now you have not just the idea of social pressure in general, but actually have government using its force or its encouragement to monitor people and get them to follow through with what the government's saying they should do?
Well, I think, curiously enough, it's a civics problem, because you have mayors and governors speaking like they think that our right to free expression comes from them or from some law or from government. It doesn't. I don't care what the local government has some control over public health, so it can limit things so you don't hurt the community, but it has no right to make a blanket pronunciation that you're not allowed to speak out about policy, especially the very policy that inhibits you from doing that. A Kentucky mayor doesn't give me my right to freedom of religion. That's a right I have innately. That's what differentiates this country from other countries, what makes us unique. And I'm not surprised that some reporter on MSNBC doesn't understand that, but I am surprised that people who swear on the Constitution, to protect the Constitution when they come into office, say things like, "I wasn't thinking about the Bill of Rights when I banned protests," as that New Jersey mayor did. I mean, it's just it's inexplicable in not just what they're doing, but how they talk about it, and it shows a lack of understanding for the Constitution. And I hate to sound like some idealist, but I mean, there are things. Of course, human life is important. We're going through something terrible here.
Right.
But it's not the only thing. We still have laws. If we can just make laws as we go along, whenever every emergency comes along, then they don't mean laws. Laws mean nothing.
Well, it goes. Yeah, David, it goes to what James Madison said: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But if angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls upon them would be necessary. Almost an exact quote. I try to remember it. But I think it's so brilliant. It goes fundamentally to what the type of constitution we have in our country is about. Finally, since we both mentioned MSNBC, I really liked this montage. This is cut 7 that Tucker Carlson had the other night, talking about how, showing how MSNBC has been not only criticizing these protesters and blasting them, but accusing them of racism.
What is it that they're trying to channel here? Is this sort of neo-Confederacy? And what the hell does that have to do with a pandemic?
America first is a phrase that was used by Charles Lindbergh and the Nazi sympathizers in 1939, 1940, 41. It became President Trump's rallying cry. You have that on the right.
When I look at these protests, what I see are a bunch of white people essentially saying, oh, it's affecting those people, so why do I have to change my life for them?
Let's be honest about what they are. They are the Fox News, Nazi Confederate, death cult rump of the Republican Party.
It's not that hard, unfortunately, to turn a health crisis into a racial, ethnic crisis.
I think that what they're saying quite clearly, when you see the numbers, when you see the statistics, when you see the CDC data, is I want more black and brown people to die. Right? That can't. If you want the government to open up, then you want more black and brown people to die.
All right, David Harsanyi, what do you make of that?
I mean, it's, obviously it's stupid, right? So the way to put it.
That's a nice way of putting it.
There were saying, and they were saying very stupid things. But more than that, I think that it's intellectual laziness, right? Where you can't make arguments anymore. So the only you immediately go to the one, to the emotionalist argument, racism. I think that that's what's happening. And that's what's been happening for a long time. The idea that, putting America first is immediately tied, that a 25-year-old who wears a red baseball hat is immediately tied to Charles Lindbergh is a ridiculous thing. And that was probably the most cogent or the most rational thing that was said through those clips. So I don't really know how to answer it. It's just idiotic. And there's no really way to push back against it, right? Because all you can say is I'm not racist. And once you say that, you're already putting yourself in a defensive position that you shouldn't even have to be in. So not saying there are no racists, by the way, there are, but I think that the vast majority of Americans don't think like that.
David Harsanyi, senior writer at the National Review. Great insights today. I really appreciate you joining us. Please stay well and healthy. And thanks for coming on, Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Once again, David Harsanyi of the National Review, where he is a senior writer, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And really, fundamentally, we have something going on here in this country with regards to free speech, whether it is Facebook trying to silence speech on these stay-at-home orders that they disagree with, that they think is wrong, or we have governments across the country, various states and municipalities that are saying, no, you cannot protest. You might be arrested. I think one woman was arrested in New Jersey, if I recall correctly, for exactly this, protesting, the audacity to actually exercise a constitutionally protected natural right to speak out against authority or to speak your mind on whatever. When that's happening with government force or with social media or with the media trying to mock and malign people in order to get them to go in line, you know that something is off here. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.